Now let's talk about ABC presenter Virginia Trioli, who on Thursday interviewed Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. Like us, the Treasurer must have been bemused by one particular premise.
Well, firstly, the key here is to get the virus under control, and we welcome, obviously, the progress in Victoria, but also across the rest of the country, because this primarily is a health crisis with a very severe economic impact.
Well, that seems to be nicely under control now, thanks to a great deal that's happened here in Victoria. So.
You heard that correctly. According to Trioli, Australia has the virus under control only because of Victoria and, by extension, Premier Daniel Andrews. Actually, Virginia, Australia had this under control over 6 months ago, or at least it did until the Andrews government was entrusted with hotel quarantine. As we now know, Victorians could not have done worse even if Ashton's circus was put in charge of the arrangements.
But ABC Orthodoxy has it that Andrews is in fact the saviour. And the mindset of a follower is that anyone who questions his wisdom is a heretic.
Can you look us all in the eye here in Victoria and say that we'd be in the same position we are right now with 34 straight days of no new infections if we'd done as you'd said back then? I've got listeners here this morning who say they simply won't forgive you for all the criticism that you made at a time when Victoria didn't need it.
There are many Victorians who will never forgive the Victorian government for the tragic loss of life and the tragic economic cost that's been incurred by a second wave that hasn't occurred in any other state.
And that the federal government failed to prevent also in aged care settings. We need to acknowledge that too.
I don't suppose it occurred to Trioli why aged care homes in other states weren't similarly affected. This was her in August, at the height of the second wave, castigating opposition leader Michael O'Brien for questioning the competence of Chairman Dan.
Now, in the middle of a pandemic with Victorians dying every day, you've gone what I guess I might phrase as the nuclear option today. You've decided to publicly declare the Premier is not fit to lead the state. Why have you said that? It's the dangerous position that you put yourself in, isn't it, Michael O'Brien, when you decide to run up the top of that hill and start calling for resignations. Goodness knows where that ends in the middle of a pandemic that no one's had to run before. My listeners are just screaming at me this morning. How important do you think a unified front is for Victorians right now? And if Victorians see a government under sustained criticism by an opposition like this right now, do you worry that it'll weaken their resolve and it'll compromise this final lockdown? Will you feel, at least in part, responsible if this lockdown fails, if people arc up and don't do the right thing because they've heard the words and the rhetoric coming from your mouth and this lockdown fails, because that lack of a unanimous purpose is communicated to the public in the middle of a pandemic and people decide, well, bugger it, I don't need to believe in Daniel Andrews, I won't do the right thing.
So forget those who died in the second wave that could have been prevented. Forget the economic catastrophe. Forget the businesses and small businesses that will never, ever recover. Actually, it's very easy to forget all of that when you're paid hundreds of thousands of dollars per year by the taxpayer. But if you thought cheerleading for the Andrews government was bad, you'll be gobsmacked by what Virginia Trioli said next.
Our run of economic recovery will fall apart and we can't really get back on our feet without China. Isn't there, Treasurer, going to have to be some sort of compromise made between Australia and China? Experts suggest that if you simply gave up that legislation to cancel state government and university agreements that allows the feds to override those agreements, and if you gave that up, that would help enormously with the relationship. You would lose nothing. Is that something you consider?
Well, if you read the 14 list of separate grievances,
I have, Treasurer, I have, and I'm not suggesting even 12. I'm suggesting one.
Unbelievable. How dare Trioli dignify that outrageous list of demands that China has made of Australia, which, if accepted, effectively would have made us a vassal state. And then there was this.
Victoria signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative is not compromising. The same one China uses as a debt trap with third world countries to expand its influence across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The same agreement that was used by China to wedge the federal government.
As Nine's political editor Chris Uhlman wrote last month of China's 14 grievances, quote, while some university chiefs and some business executives might be taking this list and checking it twice for potential moments of self-enriching obeisance, no Australian government can seriously consider any of it. If we swallowed this set of demands, do you imagine it would be the last? What do you want your children and grandchildren to concede?
Wise words indeed, Chris Uhlman. But sadly, there is no shortage of what Lenin termed useful idiots. But don't worry, Virginia. I'm sure that last week the good burgers of Fitzroy, Carlton and Richmond would have been cheering you on. Oh, and not just them.